Captain Jake Morrison stood in the center of the sacred mating pavilion, surrounded by what could only be described as living art. The Kytherian women arranged themselves in perfect symmetry around the crystalline platform, their bioluminescent skin patterns creating a constellation of beauty that made his breath catch despite the circumstances. Each one was a masterpiece of alien evolution, tall, graceful figures whose every movement seemed choreographed by celestial forces, their skin shifting through colors that had no names in human language. "Remember," Dr. Sarachan whispered through his nearly invisible earpiece, "this isn't just personal choice. The entire colonial agreement depends on these ceremonial bonds. Choose wisely." Elder Vexthara's voice resonated through the pavilion with the authority of centuries, her translation device rendering ancient Kytherian in formal English. "The ritual of aesthetic harmony begins. As our ancestors decreed, true compatibility flows from physical perfection, for beauty of form reflects beauty of spirit. Choose, Captain Morrison, and let your selection honor both our peoples." Jake's fellow colonists had already made their choices with varying degrees of diplomatic calculation. Commander Torres had selected a statuesque beauty whose silver skin patterns marked her as nobility, while Dr. Rodriguez had been drawn to a scientist whose bioluminescence pulsed in mathematical sequences. Even young Ensign Parker, barely out of the academy, had managed to choose a graceful artist whose movements painted light trails in the evening air. But Jake found himself studying not the radiant perfection surrounding him, but the figure standing apart from the others near the pavilion's edge. Where the other women glowed with health and vitality, this one seemed to absorb light rather than emit it. Scars traced harsh lines across the left side of her face, and she favored her right leg as if the left couldn't fully support her weight. Her bioluminescent patterns were dim, irregular, speaking of damage that had never properly healed. "Jake," Chen's voice carried a note of warning, "you're staring at Kiranel. Don't even think about it. She's considered damaged goods here, choosing her would be seen as an insult to their entire culture." The scarred woman, Kiranel, kept her eyes downcast, but something about her posture spoke of dignity maintained despite circumstances that would have broken lesser spirits. Jake found himself stepping closer, ignoring the subtle but frantic signals from his fellow humans. "Her story is tragic," Elder Vexthara said quietly, noticing his attention. "Once she was among our most beautiful warriors, serving as scout and protector. But the Zephyrian raiders captured her during the Outer Rim conflicts. When we finally freed her." The Elder's own bioluminescence dimmed with sadness. They had taken her voice, scarred her face, broken her body. By our laws, she can participate in the ceremony, but no one expects selection. Jake studied Kiranel's face more carefully, something nagging at the edge of his memory. The scars weren't random, they formed a pattern that seemed hauntingly familiar. The way she held her left shoulder, the specific angle of the burn marks near her eye, the way she unconsciously favored her right side. "Captain," Commander Torres's voice cut through his thoughts, "the ceremony has a time limit. The twin moons reach zenith in 30 minutes, and then the selection period closes." Around him, the other Kytherian women maintained their graceful poses, their beauty undeniable and their suitability for diplomatic alliance clear. Choosing any of them would secure the human colony's future, strengthen interspecies relations, and probably result in a perfectly adequate partnership based on mutual respect and cultural exchange. But Jake's attention remained fixed on the woman who stood apart, whose scars told stories of sacrifice and whose silence spoke louder than any diplomatic speech. Something about her stirred memories he couldn't quite grasp, fragments of smoke and fire, of desperate voices and heroic actions that had saved lives at tremendous personal cost. "Kiranel," he said quietly, testing the name on his tongue. Her head snapped up at the sound of her name spoken by a human voice, and for a moment their eyes met across the pavilion. Dark eyes, deep as space itself, holding intelligence and pain in equal measure. And in that instant of connection, Jake felt the first stirring of recognition, not of her face, which had been changed by torture, but of something deeper. Something that whispered of shared danger and desperate choices made in the heart of chaos. The other women watched with growing concern as Jake ignored their carefully displayed charms in favor of the outcast. Their bioluminescent patterns shifted to colors that probably indicated confusion or disappointment, while Elder Vexthera's expression grew increasingly diplomatic. "Captain Morrison," she said carefully, "perhaps you would benefit from observing the traditional selection process more closely. Each woman here represents the finest of Kytherian society, scientists, artists, philosophers, warriors of unblemished record." But Jake barely heard her, his attention locked on Kiranel's eyes as memory fragments began coalescing into something approaching recognition. Smoke-filled corridors. The sound of weapons fire. A voice speaking his name in accented standard just before everything went dark. Dr. Chen's whispered warnings grew more urgent. "Jake, you're making a mistake." The political ramifications. "The politics can wait," Jake said quietly, his voice carrying a certainty that surprised him. "Some things matter more than diplomatic convenience." Elder Vexthera's bioluminescence shifted to patterns that indicated profound concern. "Captain, I must advise caution. Kiranel's condition would make such a choice highly irregular. The other women offer advantages that—" "What if I'm not looking for advantages?" Jake interrupted, still studying the scarred woman's face. "What if I'm looking for someone who understands what it means to sacrifice everything for people you've never met?" The pavilion fell silent except for the gentle harmonics of crystalline architecture responding to emotional tension. Jake realized every eye was upon him, human and Kytherian alike, waiting to see whether he would make the safe political choice or follow an instinct he couldn't fully explain. Kiranel herself seemed frozen, her dark eyes holding a mixture of hope and terror that spoke of someone who had learned not to expect kindness from a universe that had already taken so much. And in that moment, Jake understood that this wasn't just about colonial agreements or diplomatic marriages. This was about recognition. The twin moons of Kyther cast dancing shadows through the pavilion's crystal dome as the ceremony entered its final phase. Jake felt the weight of expectation pressing down on him like a physical force, every human colonist, every Kytherian observer, every diplomatic protocol screaming that he was about to make the worst possible choice. 15 minutes until zenith, Elder Vexthera announced, her bioluminescent patterns shifting to colors Jake's cultural briefings had identified as profound diplomatic concern. "Captain Morrison, perhaps you would honor us by observing our finest candidates more closely." She gestured toward a group of women whose beauty literally made the air shimmer around them. Their bioluminescence pulsed in perfect synchronization, creating a light show that would have put Earth's greatest artists to shame. Among them stood Lyravan, whose silver patterns marked her as a member of the Royal Scientific Council, and Neraleth, whose golden glow indicated mastery of Kytherian combat arts. Dr. Sarah Chen materialized at Jake's shoulder with the subtle persistence of a determined diplomat. "Jake, think about this rationally. Lyravan alone would give us access to Kytherian quantum research that's centuries ahead of our own technology. And Neraleth's military connections could secure our borders against Zephyrian raiders for generations. Plus, Commander Torres added through the comm system, choosing Kiranel would be seen as the humans deliberately selecting damaged goods. It could be interpreted as mockery of their entire culture." But Jake's attention remained fixed on the scarred woman who stood apart from the others, her damaged bioluminescence creating irregular patterns that somehow seemed more honest than all the perfect symmetry surrounding her. The more he studied her, the more certain he became that this wasn't coincidence. "Dr. Chen," he said quietly, "pull up the files from the Zirian 7 incident. 3 years ago, mining station, Zephyrian attack." Chen's expression shifted from diplomatic concern to professional curiosity. "Jake, what does that have to do with?" She paused, accessing her portable database. "Zirian 7. Right, you were part of the rescue operation. 17 miners killed, 12 wounded, station completely destroyed. You were listed as MIA for 6 hours before being found in an escape pod with no memory of how you got there." "No memory," Jake repeated slowly, "but I remember fragments. Smoke. Fire. Someone pulling me through burning corridors." His eyes never left Kiranel's face. "Someone who knew my name. The ceremony continued around them as other human colonists formalized their selections with ritual exchanges of bioluminescent jewelry. Ensign Parker looked particularly pleased with his choice of a young artist whose light patterns painted abstract poetry in the air, while Dr. Rodriguez engaged in what appeared to be a scientific discussion with his selected partner through gestures and mathematical equations traced in light. Elder Vextera approached Jake with the careful steps of someone navigating a diplomatic minefield. "Captain Morrison, I must share something about Kiranel's history that may influence your consideration. Her scars were earned in service to both our peoples. She was captured during a mission to evacuate human civilians from Zephyrian-occupied territories." Jake's head snapped toward her, memory fragments suddenly coalescing into something approaching clarity. She was at Zirian 7. Among other places, the elder confirmed reluctantly. Before her capture, Kiranel served as our primary liaison for human rescue operations. She saved many lives, often at great personal risk. Her bioluminescence dimmed with sadness. The Zephyrians made her pay dearly for that service. The pieces were falling into place now, the pattern of scars that matched his fragmented memories, the way she carried herself despite obvious pain, the intelligence in her eyes that spoke of someone who had made impossible choices in desperate circumstances. "Jake," Dr. Chen's voice carried growing alarm, "you're not seriously considering this. The political ramifications alone." "Forget politics for a moment," Jake interrupted, his voice carrying a certainty that surprised him. "What if this isn't about colonial agreements or diplomatic advantage? What if this is about recognizing someone who risked everything to save human lives?" Kiranel herself seemed to sense the growing attention, her dark eyes meeting Jake's across the pavilion with something that might have been recognition. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, damaged by whatever the Zephyrians had done to her, but Jake caught the words in broken standard, "Morrison. Zirian 7. You remember?" The confirmation hit him like a physical blow. She was there. She was the mysterious figure who had saved his life, who had pulled him from burning wreckage and somehow gotten him to safety before vanishing into the chaos of the station's destruction. 5 minutes to zenith, Elder Vextera announced, though her voice carried undertones of resignation. "Captain Morrison, your selection will now be recorded in the sacred archives." Around him, the perfect Kytherian women maintained their graceful poses, their beauty undeniable and their political value clear. Choosing any of them would secure humanity's future on Kyther, strengthen interspecies relations, and probably result in a partnership based on mutual respect and cultural exchange. But Jake's choice had been made the moment he recognized the woman who had saved his life 3 years ago, whose scars were proof of her heroism rather than evidence of damage. "Captain," Commander Torres's voice crackled through the calm with military precision, "whatever you're thinking, remember that you're not just choosing for yourself. You're choosing for all of humanity's future on this world." Jake looked around the pavilion one final time, at the stunning alien women who represented political safety, at his fellow colonists who had made sensible diplomatic choices, at Elder Vextera whose bioluminescence betrayed her anxiety about what he might do. Then he looked at Kiranel, whose scars told stories of sacrifice and whose silence spoke of dignity maintained despite circumstances that would have broken most people. The woman who had risked her life to save his, who had been tortured by enemies for helping humans, who stood apart from the others not because she was less worthy but because a cruel universe had marked her with the evidence of her heroism. The choice, Jake realized, had never really been a choice at all. "Elder Vextera," he said formally, his voice carrying across the pavilion's crystalline acoustics, "I am ready to make my selection." The pavilion fell silent, the only sound the gentle harmonics of crystal architecture responding to collective held breath. Even the perfect women stopped their graceful movements, waiting to see whether the human would choose wisdom or follow some incomprehensible alien logic. Jake stepped forward, his decision made not by diplomatic calculation but by the simple recognition that some debts could only be repaid with the courage to see past surface appearances to the heroism beneath. The twin moons reached their zenith as Jake made his decision, their combined light casting the pavilion in silver radiance that made even the scarred surfaces beautiful. The moment stretched like eternity as he stood between duty and recognition, between political wisdom and personal truth. Captain Morrison, Elder Vexthera's voice carried the weight of centuries of tradition. The sacred moment has arrived. Speak your choice, and let it be recorded in the archives of both our peoples. Jake felt the eyes of every human colonist burning into his back. Through his earpiece, he could hear Dr. Chen's barely controlled breathing, Commander Torres's military discipline warring with obvious concern, and the whispered prayers of colonists who knew their entire future might hinge on this moment. The perfect Kytherian women arranged themselves with renewed grace, their bioluminescent patterns creating a galaxy of living art that spoke of scientific advancement, cultural sophistication, and political alliance. Lyra Ven's silver glow pulsed with mathematical precision, while Nyarlathot's golden radiance promised military protection and strategic advantage. But Jake's attention remained fixed on the figure standing apart from the others, whose damaged beauty told stories that mattered more than diplomatic convenience. Before I choose, Jake said, his voice carrying across the crystalline acoustics with unexpected strength, may I address Kiranel directly? The pavilion erupted in surprised murmurs, both human and Kytherian. Speaking to the candidate before selection violated several levels of protocol, but Elder Vexthera's curiosity seemed to override her diplomatic training. This is highly irregular, she said slowly, but perhaps understanding may serve both our peoples. You may speak. Jake stepped closer to Kiranel, close enough to see the intelligence burning in her dark eyes despite the scars that mapped her suffering. When he spoke, it was in the broken Kytherian he'd learned from cultural briefings, his pronunciation probably terrible but his intent clear. Do you remember a burning station? A human named Morrison who was trapped in Section 7 when the Zephyrians attacked. The reaction was immediate and profound. Kiranel's bioluminescence, dim and irregular though it was, suddenly flared with patterns Jake had never seen before, not the controlled displays of the other women, but something raw and emotional that spoke of memories long buried. Morrison, she whispered, her damaged voice making his name sound like a prayer. Zirian, 7. You were dying. Smoke inhalation, burns on your arms. I carried you to the escape pod. The confirmation sent shockwaves through Jake's memory. Suddenly he could see it clearly. The mysterious figure in combat armor, face hidden behind a tactical mask, who had appeared in the smoke-filled corridor like an angel of mercy. The way she'd spoken his name with careful pronunciation, the gentle strength with which she'd supported his weight as they navigated the burning station. You disappeared before I could thank you, Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. The rescue team found me in an escape pod with no memory of how I got there. I've been looking for my guardian angel for 3 years. Dr. Chen's voice crackled through the earpiece with growing alarm. Jake, this is incredibly touching, but you're about to commit political suicide. The entire colonial agreement can survive one person choosing truth over convenience, Jake interrupted, never taking his eyes off Kiranel's scarred face. Elder Vexthera stepped forward, her bioluminescence shifting to patterns Jake couldn't interpret. Captain Morrison, are you certain you understand the implications? Kiranel's condition makes her challenging to integrate into normal Kytherian society. Her scars, her damaged voice, her physical limitations are proof of her heroism, Jake said firmly. She didn't get those scars in an accident. She earned them saving human lives, including mine. If your society sees that as damage, then your society is wrong. The words carried across the pavilion like a physical blow. Several of the perfect women exchanged glances, their bioluminescent patterns shifting to colors that probably indicated shock or confusion. Even Kiranel herself seemed stunned by his vehement defense. 3 minutes to final selection, Elder Vexthera announced, though her voice carried undertones of something that might have been approval. Captain Morrison, the archives await your decision. Jake looked around the pavilion one final time. At the stunning alien women who represented safety and political advantage. At his fellow colonists who had made sensible choices based on careful calculation. At the elder whose expression suggested she was witnessing something unprecedented in centuries of ceremonial tradition. Then he looked at Kiranel, whose dark eyes held a mixture of hope and terror that spoke of someone who had learned not to expect kindness from a universe that had already taken so much. "May I ask you something?" Jake said to her quietly, ignoring the watching crowd. "Do you remember what you said to me in that escape pod before I lost consciousness?" Kiranel's bioluminescence flickered with what might have been embarrassment. I said many things. You were delirious from smoke inhalation. You said something in English. Perfect English, despite the chaos around us." Her damaged voice dropped to barely a whisper. "I said, you're going to be okay. Someone will find you. Someone will remember you were worth saving." The memory hit Jake like a physical blow. Not just the words, but the way she'd said them, with absolute conviction despite the station burning around them. She'd risked her life to save a stranger, had been captured and tortured for helping humans, and still maintained her faith that life was worth preserving. "1 minute," Elder Vexthera announced, her bioluminescence now pulsing with patterns that seemed almost excited. "Captain Morrison, your selection will create bonds that cannot be broken, agreements that will last lifetimes. Choose wisely." Jake stepped closer to Kiranel, close enough to see himself reflected in her dark eyes. "You were right," he said softly. "Someone did remember I was worth saving. But I never forgot that someone else was worth finding." Around them, the pavilion held its breath as the moment of decision arrived. The perfect women maintained their graceful poses, their beauty undeniable and their political value clear. The human colonists waited with barely concealed anxiety for a choice that would determine their future on this world. But Jake's choice had been made 3 years ago in a burning corridor, confirmed by recognition that transcended physical appearance to acknowledge the heroism that lived in the most unexpected places. "Elder Vexthera," he said formally, his voice carrying across the crystalline acoustics with absolute certainty, "I choose Kiranel." The words hit the pavilion like a thunderclap, creating a moment of perfect silence before the universe seemed to explode around them in shocked whispers, alarmed bioluminescent displays, and what Jake was pretty sure were several diplomatic heart attacks occurring simultaneously among his fellow humans. But all that mattered was the look in Kiranel's eyes as she realized that someone had finally seen past her scars to recognize the person she truly was. Not damaged goods, but a hero who had sacrificed everything for people she'd never met, and who had somehow found her way back to the man whose life she'd saved. The pavilion erupted in chaos as Jake's words echoed through the crystalline architecture. Gasps from the human delegation mixed with alarmed bioluminescent displays from the Kytherian observers, while the perfect alien women stood frozen in poses of graceful shock. "Captain Morrison," Dr. Chen's voice crackled through his earpiece with barely controlled panic, "do you realize what you've just done? The political ramifications." "Can wait," Jake said firmly, stepping past the galaxy of perfect beauty to approach the woman who stood apart from the others. "Some things matter more than politics." Kiranel watched his approach with eyes that held decades of pain and the fragile beginning of hope. Her scarred hands trembled as Jake drew near, and her damaged bioluminescence flickered with patterns that seemed to tell stories of disbelief and wonder. "You choose me," she whispered, her damaged voice making the words sound like a prayer. "But I am broken. Scarred. Not beautiful like the others." Jake stopped directly in front of her, close enough to see the individual patterns of her scars, each one a testament to torture endured rather than betraying human allies. "You're the most beautiful person I've ever met," he said simply. "Not because of how you look, but because of who you are. You risked everything to save people you'd never met. You endured torture rather than betray those who trusted you. If that's not beautiful, then the word has no meaning." Elder Vexthera stepped forward, her bioluminescence shifting through patterns that Jake's cultural briefings had never covered, something between amazement and what might have been approval. "Captain Morrison, I must inform you that your selection creates certain complications." "What kind of complications?" Commander Torres demanded, her military training warring with diplomatic necessity. The elder's glow intensified as she prepared to reveal something significant. "Kiranel is my daughter. The announcement hit the pavilion like a physical blow. Even the perfect women abandoned their graceful poses to stare in shock, while the human delegation struggled to process this new information. Your daughter. Dr. Chen's voice rose an octave. But the briefing said she was an outcast, damaged goods. The briefings were correct, Elder Vexthera said sadly. When Kiranel returned from Zephyrian captivity, our laws required that I disown her. Her scars marked her as unsuitable for normal society. I was forced to cast her out to preserve family honor. Jake felt anger rising in his chest, not at the elder, whose bioluminescence betrayed her own pain, but at a system that could reduce a hero to damaged property. So you've been watching your own daughter stand alone at these ceremonies, knowing no one would choose her. For 3 years, the elder whispered, her glow dimming with shame. 3 years of watching her hope and be disappointed, of pretending I didn't recognize the daughter I raised. Kiranel's bioluminescence suddenly flared with emotions too complex for Jake to interpret. Mother, she said in her damaged voice, the word carrying decades of suppressed longing. The ceremony's formal structure dissolved as Elder Vexthera stepped forward, her ancient dignity cracking to reveal a parent's love held in check by cultural obligation. My daughter. My brave, beautiful daughter who saved so many lives and paid such a terrible price. Jake watched the reunion with growing understanding. This wasn't just about choosing a mate, was it? This was about someone finally seeing past the scars to recognize her worth. The ritual of aesthetic harmony, Elder Vexthera explained, tears of light streaming down her face, was created to ensure compatibility through beauty. But true beauty isn't always visible to the eye. By choosing Kiranel, you have honored the deepest principles of our culture, recognizing worth that others cannot see. Dr. Chen's voice carried newfound respect. Jake, I think you just accidentally performed the most sophisticated piece of cultural diplomacy in human history. But Jake barely heard her, his attention focused entirely on Kiranel as she struggled to process this complete reversal of her circumstances. I don't understand, she whispered. I am still scarred. Still broken. Still the woman who saved my life, Jake interrupted gently, taking her hands in his despite their trembling. Still the hero who endured torture rather than betray innocent people. Still the most courageous person I've ever met. The other Kytherian women began approaching slowly, their perfect bioluminescence creating patterns Jake recognized as respect and admiration. Lyra Ven spoke first, her silver glow pulsing with mathematical precision. We have heard stories of your courage, Kiranel. We are honored to be in your presence. Nyraletha's golden radiance added its own testimony, your sacrifice for human civilians is legend among the warrior caste. We were told you were damaged, but we see now that your scars are marks of honor. Jake realized that Kiranel's isolation hadn't been about her appearance, it had been about a culture too ashamed of its own prejudices to acknowledge the heroism in their midst. By choosing her, he hadn't just followed his heart, he'd given an entire society permission to recognize the beauty they'd been trained to overlook. The bonding ceremony will proceed, Elder Vexthera announced, her bioluminescence now blazing with joy that made the pavilion's crystals sing in harmonic response. Captain Morrison, by choosing true beauty over surface appearance, you have honored both our peoples and shown us the way to deeper understanding. As the formal rituals began, Jake found himself participating in traditions that suddenly felt profound rather than diplomatic. When Kiranel placed her scarred hand in his during the Unity blessing, her bioluminescence flickered with patterns of pure joy that painted the entire pavilion in colors that spoke of hope reborn. Thank you, she whispered as the ceremony concluded with crystalline music that seemed to celebrate their unlikely union. For seeing me. For remembering. For choosing truth over convenience. Jake smiled, watching as her mother, no longer an elder forced to deny her daughter, but simply a parent reunited with a child she'd never stopped loving, approached with tears of light streaming down her face. Thank you, he replied, for saving my life 3 years ago. And for teaching me that sometimes the most beautiful thing in the universe is someone who chooses to be a hero when no one is watching. Around them, the pavilion filled with celebration as both species recognized that the most meaningful connections transcended cultural expectations to acknowledge the courage that lived in the most unexpected places. The perfect women no longer seemed quite so perfect compared to someone whose scars told stories of sacrifice, whose damaged voice carried more truth than any diplomatic speech. And in the space between one heartbeat and the next, Jake understood that beauty wasn't about surface perfection, it was about the light that shone from souls brave enough to risk everything for others, bright enough to be seen across 3 years of separation and strong enough to transform an entire civilization's understanding of what truly mattered. The universe, as it turned out, had an excellent sense of timing when it came to reuniting heroes with the people whose lives they'd saved.